The train conductor never looks at anyone, but the protagonist notices he's always watching them through the mirror. The train screeched and groaned as it trudged through the desolate, darkened countryside. The once bustling train station had been abandoned for years, its windows shattered and doors creaking like a skeleton's bones. It was late, so late that the thick fog, rolling like a blanket of death, seemed to swallow the train whole, leaving nothing but the distant sound of the tracks beneath. The only light was from the flickering overhead bulbs, casting long, haunting shadows across the empty seats. Inside, the train was near deserted, with only a few weary passengers scattered about, their faces obscured in the dimness. No one spoke. The air felt thick, heavy with a presence no one wanted to acknowledge. Peter, a young man in his mid-20s, had boarded the train in a sleepy town he couldn't even remember the name of. He was tired, trying to sleep off the long journey, but the eerie stillness of the train left him uneasy. He noticed the conductor early on, standing silently at the front of the train. The man, tall and gaunt, wore the same grim expression every time Peter glanced his way. His eyes never seemed to meet Peter's. He was always looking down at the floor or staring out the window, never at the passengers. It was strange, the way the conductor moved, his stiff, almost robotic gait. And then there was the mirror, the large, cracked mirror that hung in the narrow hallway between the cars. Peter had noticed it from the moment he stepped on. The mirror reflected the train's interior, giving a glimpse of the passengers, the seats, the lights, but also the conductor. In the reflection, Peter saw him moving, always moving. But there was something odd about it. The conductor's eyes, they weren't looking forward as they should. They were looking straight at Peter. Peter turned his head quickly, but the conductor was still facing the front of the train, his eyes down, his back rigid. Peter tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his imagination. The long hours of travel, the silence, the strange atmosphere, they were playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, the conductor was still there, his eyes locked on him, even though he never once looked directly at him. A few minutes passed. The train sped through the fog, rattling with the sound of old wheels on worn tracks. Peter, unable to ignore the nagging feeling at the back of his mind, rose from his seat. He glanced at the mirror again. This time, his heart skipped a beat. The conductor was standing still, facing him directly in the mirror. His head was tilted ever so slightly to the side, his eyes wide and unblinking. Peter's breath caught in his throat. He quickly looked away, feeling the weight of the conductor's gaze on him. "I'm just being paranoid," he muttered to himself. But deep down, he wasn't so sure anymore. Peter walked down the aisle toward the next car, hoping to escape the feeling of being watched. But as he passed the mirror, he saw the conductor again. And this time the conductor smiled, just a little, barely noticeable. It was an unnatural smile, stretching too wide for comfort, and something about it made Peter's skin crawl. His heartbeat quickened. "What is going on?" he whispered, his mind racing. The train jolted, and the lights flickered again. When Peter turned back to look toward the front of the train, the conductor was gone. Nowhere to be seen. The car was silent. Too silent. Even the other passengers, who had been slumped in their seats, appeared to be staring at the windows, as if they could see something out there in the dark. Something that wasn't there. Peter walked toward the front of the train. He didn't know what compelled him to move forward, but he felt a strange urge to see the conductor again. As he neared the last car, he froze. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see the conductor's reflection. But this time, the reflection was of him, Peter, standing in the doorway. The conductor wasn't moving, but the mirror reflected him as if he had stepped right into the car. Peter stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to speak, but no words came. Something cold crept down his spine. The train suddenly lurched to a halt, the sound of screeching metal filling the air. "Is everything all right?" A voice echoed from behind him. Peter spun around. The voice belonged to Sarah, a woman sitting a few rows back. She had been staring out the window the whole time, her pale face expressionless. Did you see him?" Peter stammered. "See who?" Sarah's eyes narrowed, confused. The conductor. He's watching me. Sarah's eyes flickered to the front of the train, but she didn't answer. Her lips were tight, her face pale. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity, until the sound of a distant whistle broke the quiet. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the train lurched back into motion, its engine groaning to life once more. But Peter knew something had changed. He glanced toward the front, to where the conductor should have been. But the man was gone, completely gone. Or perhaps he thought he was never there. As the train sped on into the dark night, Peter looked back toward Sarah, only to find that she was no longer there. The car was empty, completely empty. The only thing left was the mirror. And in the reflection, the conductor stood, still smiling, his eyes now wide open and staring straight at Peter. But this time, the mirror was cracked, spiderwebs of broken glass framing the conductor's face, as though something had already reached through it. Something far worse than Peter could ever imagine. The train rattled and groaned, moving relentlessly through the night. The fog outside thickened, swallowing the landscape whole, and only the dim, flickering lights of the train's interior illuminated the passenger cars. Peter, his mind racing, stood frozen in the doorway between the cars, staring at the cracked mirror. He had seen things in the reflection, things that no one should see. The conductor's smile, twisted and unnatural, the way his eyes seemed to follow Peter wherever he went, even though the man never once looked directly at him. And now Sarah, where had she gone? One moment, she was there, asking questions, trying to make sense of it all. And the next, she was simply gone, like the rest of the passengers. Peter's breath was shallow. His heart hammered against his chest. He turned toward the empty car, the unsettling silence pressing in on him, and slowly, hesitantly, he stepped back into the hallway, his eyes glued to the mirror. The conductor's reflection still stood there, no longer smiling, but staring at him unblinking. Something is wrong with this train, Peter thought, his mind spiraling into confusion. He didn't know whether he should scream, run, or just wake up from this nightmare. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't stay on this train much longer. Forcing his feet to move, Peter walked slowly, cautiously toward the next car. He hoped, prayed, that by some miracle, things would feel normal again. That the train would continue to its destination, and the conductor would simply be a strange, unsettling person who never made eye contact. Maybe he had imagined the whole thing, but no matter how much he tried to reason with himself, his fear gnawed at him. His instincts screamed at him to escape, to get off this train, to find another way home. But no matter how hard he tried, the train would not stop. He reached the end of the hallway and turned to open the next door. The handle was cold to the touch. When he stepped into the next car, a sudden chill filled the air. The car, once full of passengers, was now completely empty. Just like the others, he glanced to the side, toward the back of the train, where the doors should have been. It was dark, too dark to make out anything clearly. But Peter swore he saw something, a shadow moving just beyond the train car. He could feel his pulse quicken. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like a distant voice. A whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Help me!" Peter froze. His stomach churned. The whisper was unmistakable now. It was a voice, familiar but not quite. "Hello!" Peter called out shakily, but the only response was the whisper growing louder. More desperate. "Help me! He's coming!" The voice was unmistakably Sarah's. Peter's throat tightened. He felt a sickening coldness spread from the pit of his stomach, creeping up his chest and into his throat. He turned, looking for Sarah, hoping, praying, that she was somewhere in the car. But the only thing he saw was his reflection in the window. And in the glass, he saw the conductor again, staring at him from across the aisle. He had never moved, but there he was, his pale, lifeless eyes fixed on Peter, as though he could see straight through him. "What do you want?" Peter whispered, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" The conductor didn't move. His face remained expressionless, the smile gone. But his eyes, they never left Peter's gaze. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the train, followed by a series of low, muffled thuds. Peter's body jerked in shock, his heart threatening to leap from his chest. He turned quickly, looking toward the source of the noise. The doors at the back of the car had opened. A dark figure stood silhouetted against the blackness, and for a moment, Peter couldn't make out who it was. But then the figure stepped forward, revealing itself to be none other than Sarah. But this was not the Sarah he had spoken to moments ago. Her hair was wild, tangled in a mess of strands that seemed to move on their own. Her face pale and distorted, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream. Peter took a step back, a wave of dread washing over him. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "What happened to you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Her body jerked forward, stumbling toward him, her arms outstretched as though trying to grab him. "Stay away from me," Peter screamed, stumbling backward into the seat. But Sarah's arms reached out, her fingers long and twisted like claws, her mouth now gaping wide as if she were about to swallow him whole. Her eyes, those eyes, were not hers. Peter's vision blurred, the edges of his world growing darker, the train around him swaying as if it were drifting through a void. The walls of the car seemed to close in on him. He reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The car had sealed itself shut. The air turned stale and thick, pressing against him like an invisible weight. The conductor's reflection in the mirror seemed to grin now. Peter stumbled back, panic surging through him. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. The train slowed to a stop again, the creaking of the brakes cutting through the silence. And then, in the distance, Peter heard something far worse than anything he had encountered yet. It was a low, guttural growl. Not from Sarah, from something behind her. Something worse. Peter turned around and gasped. The train had come to a complete stop, but outside the windows, the fog had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't fog anymore. It was moving. It rolled and slithered, swirling like something alive, like a great beast that was closing in around the train. It was coming for him. A sudden, bone-chilling scream pierced the air. Sarah's scream. But it wasn't just Sarah. It was 1,000 voices, all screaming in unison. And within that sound, Peter heard something familiar. The whisper from before. "He's coming. The conductor is coming." The conductor, Peter realized in a sickening moment of clarity, wasn't just watching him. He was the train. The train was part of him, and every soul that had ever boarded it became a piece of him. The creature, the conductor, was the engine of death, dragging souls into the depths of the void, never to be seen again. He was the reason the train never stopped, the reason the passengers were gone, and the reason that Peter would never escape. "You are part of it now," the voice echoed through Peter's mind, the conductor's voice, low and sinister. "There is no leaving the train." Suddenly, the train lurched again. The lights flickered and buzzed, throwing everything into chaos. Peter ran, desperately clawing at the door, the floor shaking beneath him as the train began to move once more. He turned to look behind him. The conductor stood at the end of the hallway, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his wide, unblinking eyes fixed on Peter. A smile stretched across his face, jagged and cruel, as the train sped up again. Peter's heart pounded in his chest. His body felt like it was made of lead, weighed down by fear. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The walls were closing in, the air thick with despair. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the train came to a stop. Everything went silent. The train was still. Peter dared to open his eyes, trembling as he slowly looked around. But the train was gone. The fog, the walls, the conductor, they had all vanished, leaving him standing alone in the middle of an endless, empty field. Peter collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily, his mind racing. Had it all been a nightmare? Had he been dreaming? But then just ahead he saw a figure. A dark, gaunt figure standing in the distance. The conductor. And he was watching Peter with those same unblinking eyes. The fog around Peter thickened, and the cold seeped into his bones. His breath formed clouds in the air, and every part of his body screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, as though it wasn't real, as though the entire world around him were a false creation, a nightmare that had somehow become reality. The conductor stood still, his figure dark and undefined in the distance. Peter couldn't move. His mind was racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Had he been trapped on that train, lost in a place between life and death? The fog grew heavier, and Peter's heart pounded harder in his chest. No, this isn't real, Peter whispered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. He tried to move his feet, to force himself to run, but his legs felt heavy, like they were trapped in concrete. It's a dream. It has to be. But then the figure began to move, slowly at first, as though it were a predator stalking its prey. The shape of the conductor remained distant, but Peter could see now, with startling clarity, the awful details of his appearance. He was tall, impossibly tall, his limbs elongated and unnatural. His face was the same pale, gaunt figure Peter had seen on the train. His eyes were wide and vacant, devoid of any human emotion. But there was something worse, something far more terrifying in those eyes. There was hunger. The conductor moved toward him, one step at a time, his long fingers twitching like claws. Peter's mind screamed for him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The world was closing in, the fog pressing against his skin, choking him. Peter took a shaky breath and tried to steady himself. He glanced around. There was nothing, no escape, just the void stretching out around him. His hand reached into his jacket pocket, fingers trembling, searching for something, anything that might help him. But there was nothing. His phone, gone. His wallet, gone. His hope. It had vanished the moment he had stepped onto the cursed train. The conductor was closer now, so close that Peter could see the faint reflection of himself in the conductor's glassy eyes. He was staring at Peter, and Peter could feel it. Every ounce of his existence laid bare. The conductor's smile curled up slightly, as though savoring Peter's fear. It was an unsettling, slow, almost sickening movement. "Please," Peter managed to say, his voice cracked with terror. "What do you want from me?" The conductor's lips did not move, but Peter heard the words as if they were spoken directly into his mind. "You are mine now. You belong to the train. You always have, and you always will." Peter staggered back, his chest heaving with panic. He turned his head, searching the endless expanse of fog for any sign of hope, but the world had become a suffocating, claustrophobic prison. The ground beneath him seemed to give way, and for a moment, Peter felt himself slipping, sliding into darkness. "Wake up," he whispered desperately, his voice cracking with the plea. I'm dreaming. But the fog thickened around him, and the conductor's laugh echoed in the distance. It was a laugh that reverberated deep within his chest, rattling his bones, causing his spine to stiffen with a primal terror. Peter could feel it now, the weight of being trapped. He had crossed into something otherworldly, something that defied explanation. He had stepped beyond the world of the living, into something much worse. The conductor's feet were now just a few paces from him. His face was expressionless, but Peter could feel the hunger emanating from him like a cold, invisible mist. The conductor was not a man, not entirely. He was something older, something darker, a thing born of fear, fed by it. The air around Peter grew colder still, and he could feel a chill seeping into his very soul. He stumbled backward, his limbs refusing to respond, his body too weak to fight back. The conductor's face loomed closer. His eyes never blinked, and his lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing teeth that seemed far too long, far too sharp. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered inside Peter's mind. "You never could." In that moment, Peter realized that there was no escape, no running, no fighting. He had already been claimed. And then the train returned. It wasn't like the train had reappeared. It was as though it had never left. It surged back into existence, wrapping around Peter like a tightening noose. The hiss of steam, the screeching of the wheels on the tracks, the low hum of the engine, it all returned, a suffocating reminder of what he had endured. The train was here, and with it, the conductor. But now, Peter wasn't standing outside the train anymore. He was inside. The walls were dark, the flickering lights above casting deep shadows on the seats, but something had changed. The seats weren't empty. The people who had been here, the ones who had vanished, were back. They were staring at him now, their eyes wide, their faces empty, their mouths agape in silent screams. And in their eyes, Peter saw it, what he had become, what they had all become. The train was a prison. The passengers weren't just souls trapped on a cursed ride. They were pieces of the same horror, locked in a perpetual cycle of suffering, feeding the train's insatiable need for more. Each one had been taken, absorbed into the nightmare of the conductor's realm, never to escape. Peter's legs buckled, and he fell to his knees. He wanted to scream, to wake up, but his voice was gone. The train's walls closed in, and he could feel the conductor's presence, looming just beyond the darkness. The train was moving now, rumbling forward, but Peter couldn't tell if it was real or just another twisted illusion. The sound of the train grew louder, overwhelming his senses until it was all that remained. The conductor's footsteps echoed in the distance, growing nearer, until Peter felt the cold presence of the man standing just behind him. "It's your turn," the voice whispered. "You've been chosen." Peter's chest tightened as the fog surrounding the train thickened, pressing against him like a suffocating hand. The passengers sat motionless, but he knew. They knew. They had all been chosen too. All of them were doomed to live this nightmare forever. And now it was his turn. With trembling hands, Peter reached out toward the mirror in front of him. It was the same cracked mirror he had seen before, the one that showed the reflection of the conductor. But this time, Peter didn't see himself. He didn't see the conductor. What he saw was something far worse. He saw himself, trapped in the reflection. He was still there, standing in the mirror, staring back at him with wide, vacant eyes. Peter's heart stopped as the reflection began to twist, his face warping into something monstrous. The reflection of the conductor moved toward him, and as the shadow of the conductor loomed closer, Peter's body froze in terror. "It's too late now," the voice in his head echoed, louder than before. "You are mine. You are part of the train. Forever." Peter opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. The air grew colder, suffocating him. His body felt weightless, as though he were falling into the abyss. His legs no longer obeyed, his hands unable to move. The train rumbled on, and Peter could feel himself slipping away into the darkness. The conductor's cold, empty eyes were the last thing he saw. And then there was nothing. The train's rumbling became a distant echo in Peter's ears as the world around him dissolved into darkness. His body felt weightless, adrift, as though he was no longer tethered to reality. The suffocating cold of the train pressed against him from all sides, but the familiar hum of the engine grew faint, replaced by a strange silence. Then the whisper returned. It was faint at first, just a faint murmur that tickled at the edge of his consciousness, like a forgotten memory trying to resurface. But it didn't feel like the conductor's voice. It was different, softer, more desperate, and the voice was familiar. "Peter, Peter, can you hear me?" His name rang through the emptiness, pulling him back from the abyss. His body stiffened, his senses awakening, and he was suddenly aware of a strange pressure on his chest, as though someone were pressing down on him. His eyelids flickered open, but the world that greeted him was not the train, not the fog, not the endless void. He was lying on something soft, a bed. The air smelled clean, fresh, almost like flowers. The faint rustling of trees reached his ears. A breeze, warm and comforting, brushed against his face. Slowly, painfully, Peter propped himself up, his vision still blurry, his body aching. He looked around, confused. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in ages. He was in a room, a small, cozy room with pale blue walls and a window that opened to a garden outside. The curtains were drawn back, and sunlight filtered through, casting gentle beams of light on the hardwood floor. The room was calm, peaceful, nothing like the suffocating terror he had just experienced. A sound came from the doorway, and Peter's heart skipped a beat. He looked up quickly, expecting to see something horrible, something dark. Instead, he saw Sarah. Her face was soft, her features serene, and she was smiling gently at him. The wildness he had seen in her eyes before was gone, replaced by an expression of calm that felt almost surreal in its peacefulness. She stepped into the room slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "Sarah?" Peter's voice was barely above a whisper. He reached out to her, but she gently took a step back. "You're safe now," she said softly, her voice warm and comforting. "You're safe here. Everything will be okay." Peter stared at her in disbelief. How could she be here? What was happening? This didn't make sense. He had just been on that train, that cursed train. He had seen the conductor's eyes, felt the cold grip of the nightmare closing in on him. And yet, here he was in this peaceful room, surrounded by light and calmness. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the confusion that clouded his mind. "Where am I?" he asked again, his voice trembling. "What happened to the train? The conductor?" Sarah's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of something dark passing through her eyes, but it was gone so quickly that Peter wasn't sure he had seen it at all. She moved to the side of the bed, her steps light and careful. "You're not on the train anymore, Peter," she said, her voice lowering, as though sharing a secret. "You're safe. We all are." Peter felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Her words were comforting, but something in her tone didn't sit right. He could hear the strain in her voice, as though she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince him. "We?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Who else is here?" But before Sarah could answer, Peter heard something else, a sound from beyond the door. It was a soft scraping, as though something heavy was being dragged along the floor. A chill ran through him, and his heart began to pound again. This wasn't right. None of this was right. His instincts screamed at him to get out of bed, to run, but his body felt weak, as though it wasn't his own. "What's that?" he asked, his voice cracking with fear. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Peter noticed her fingers tightening around the edge of the bed. She took a deep breath, her eyes darting nervously to the door. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "Just relax. Everything is fine now." Peter's eyes narrowed. "Sarah, you're lying." The words slipped out before he could stop them. "What's happening? Where are we?" Before Sarah could respond, the door opened with a creak. Peter's breath caught in his throat. Standing in the doorway was the conductor. His tall, gaunt figure loomed in the frame, and his unblinking eyes locked onto Peter's. His pale face was stretched into that unsettling, jagged smile that Peter had seen in the mirror, but now it was different, distorted, like a mask that didn't quite fit. The conductor's lips curled upward, revealing sharp teeth, but his gaze remained cold, calculating. "You can't run from me," the conductor said softly, his voice a low, drawn-out whisper. "You belong to the train. You always will." Peter felt his blood run cold. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get away, but he couldn't move. He was frozen in place, his limbs refusing to obey. The room began to spin, the walls seeming to close in around him. The peacefulness of the room was shattering, like fragile glass. "No!" Peter shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "I'm not going back. I can't." But the conductor's smile widened, stretching impossibly wide. His eyes narrowed, and Peter could feel the overwhelming presence of darkness pressing down on him. "You don't have a choice," the conductor said, stepping forward, his voice becoming colder. "You will never escape. You'll stay here with me forever." The air in the room grew thick, oppressive. Peter's chest tightened. His lungs were screaming for air, but none came. His eyes darted to Sarah, but she was no longer the comforting figure she had been just moments ago. Her face was twisted, her skin pale, her eyes hollow. "Sarah?" Peter whispered, his voice breaking. Sarah's lips curled into a slow, sinister smile. She stepped back, her hands raised in surrender. "I told you, Peter, you were never meant to leave." The room around them dissolved, fading into the same darkness that had consumed him before. The bed was gone, the walls disappeared, and Peter felt himself falling once again, plummeting into the void. But this time it was different. The walls of the train car were visible now, emerging from the darkness. The train was back, its groaning engine, the flickering lights, the strange, otherworldly hum of its power. And through the murky haze of the train, Peter could see the other passengers, the ones who had vanished, staring at him, their faces empty and cold. And then Peter realized he wasn't the only one who had been trapped. He had never truly left. The conductor stood before him once more, his unblinking eyes fixed on Peter, his sharp smile still stretched wide. But this time Peter understood. The train was not just a place. It was a trap, a prison, and every soul that entered, every passenger that boarded, was destined to remain here. The train did not have a destination. It was a journey that never ended. "You're one of us now," the conductor whispered, his voice filled with a satisfaction that made Peter's skin crawl. "You're a part of the train, forever." As the fog closed in again, the lights dimmed, and the train began to move, Peter could feel the suffocating pull of darkness closing around him once more. The air grew cold, the train rumbled forward, and the endless journey began again. And as the conductor's eyes never left his, Peter realized with chilling clarity, he was not just a passenger anymore. He was the next conductor, and there was no getting off. The train's cold steel walls creaked, groaning under the weight of years, or perhaps centuries, of endless travel. The hiss of the steam was now a low, echoing hum that vibrated through Peter's bones. He wanted to scream, to tear at his skin and wake from this nightmare, but the words lodged in his throat, as if the very air had turned against him, suffocating his pleas. The conductor's eyes never wavered. They were locked onto him, two dark, hollow pools of inhuman emptiness that seemed to peel away at Peter's very soul. "Welcome back," the conductor whispered, his voice a soft, mocking melody, as though savoring Peter's struggle. "It's time for you to understand. You've always been here. You just didn't know it yet." Peter's heart hammered against his ribcage, an erratic beat as if it too were trapped in this cursed machine. He opened his mouth, trying to form words, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. The other passengers, their faces pale and unmoving, watched him with glassy eyes, their mouths locked in silent horror. Some were familiar, people he'd seen in fleeting moments before, in fleeting fragments. But others were strangers, their faces twisted in fear and despair. "You aren't the first to ask questions, Peter," the conductor continued, his voice low and deliberate. "Nor will you be the last. But you will learn what they all learned. There is no escape from the train. You can't run. You can't fight. You belong to it now." Peter's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. "No!" His voice cracked, his throat raw. "I didn't ask for this. I don't belong here. Let me go." The conductor's smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, his teeth now razor-sharp and jagged, gleaming in the dim light of the train. "It's too late for that. You have already crossed over." Peter recoiled, his pulse racing. He had already crossed over. He had already been claimed. And now he understood. The conductor wasn't just a keeper of the train. He was its embodiment. The train wasn't a vehicle. It was a living, breathing entity, a thing that fed on souls, that trapped the lost, the broken, and the broken-hearted. Those who wandered in too deep were never seen again. And Peter had wandered too far. His thoughts raced as he turned away from the conductor, his gaze landing on the passengers once more. Some were older, their faces lined with years of suffering. Others were much younger, their eyes wide with that same confusion and terror that Peter had felt when he first boarded. A cold realization washed over him. They were all just like him. They had all been taken. The train continued its relentless journey through the fog, the world outside a blur of shadow and mist. Every few moments, the light flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. There was no rhythm to the movement of the train. It jerked and swayed as though the tracks themselves were unstable, uncharted, carrying them further into darkness. "Why? Why me?" Peter's voice trembled. He didn't care if he sounded weak. He needed answers. He needed to understand. "Why are you doing this? What is this place?" The conductor was silent for a moment. The train's vibrations hummed in the background, a constant reminder of the prison they were trapped in. "This place," the conductor said finally, his voice quiet but filled with power, "is beyond your comprehension. It's not for you to understand, Peter. It exists in between worlds, in a space where time doesn't matter, where the living and the dead are one. It's where souls are drawn, and where they stay, forever." Peter's stomach twisted, nausea rolling through him. He wanted to throw up, to claw his way out, but there was no escape. He could feel it now, the weight of the curse. The train had been built on suffering, and each passenger aboard was part of its endless, insatiable hunger. No matter how much they begged or fought, they were all drawn to it, trapped inside it. The conductor took a slow step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He reached out a hand, and in that instant, Peter understood. The conductor wasn't just a person. He wasn't even a man. He was the train itself, his form of vessel for its malevolent spirit. The train's curse had chosen him, just as it had chosen everyone else before him. "I know what you're thinking." The conductor's voice was almost soothing now, as though he could sense Peter's terror. "You're wondering if you're going to end up like them, like the others." Peter didn't respond. He couldn't speak, couldn't form the words, because his mind had already begun to unravel. He couldn't bear to look at the other passengers, but he couldn't turn away either. Their hollow gazes burned into him, each face a silent testimony to the eternal torment they endured. Each one had been like him. Each one had fought to escape, only to be swallowed up by the train's insidious grasp. The conductor took another step, his voice lowering to a chilling whisper. "You think you can change things. You think you can wake up from this. But you can't." His smile grew wider, more predatory. "The train takes what it wants, and when you're in it, you belong to it. Forever." Peter was paralyzed, trapped within his own body, unable to break free of the suffocating grip the train had on him. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but something held him in place, as though invisible chains bound him to the seat. Then something strange happened. From the far end of the train, where the shadows were deepest, a figure emerged. It was a woman, but not a woman. At least, not in the traditional sense. Her hair was long and black, but tangled in a way that made it seem like it had been pulled by something far darker than the natural world. Her eyes, though once alive, were empty, a void, a darkness, a mirror of the conductor's dead gaze. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, as though the life had been drained from her long ago. "No," Peter whispered. "No, you can't be." The woman's lips parted, and her voice came out as a low, gravelly whisper. "It's too late for all of us." The room seemed to grow colder still. The lights flickered again, plunging the space into a deep, suffocating darkness for just a moment. When they came back on, the woman was closer, standing beside Peter, her presence overwhelming. Her touch, when it came, was cold as ice, and it seemed to pass through his very skin, sinking deep into his bones. "I thought I could escape too," the woman said softly, her voice filled with despair. "But you don't get out of here. No one does." Peter turned his head, his heart thudding in his chest. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words died in his throat. This woman, she had been here longer than him, far longer. She knew the truth Peter didn't want to face. "How long have you been here?" Peter managed to choke out. The woman's eyes met his, and the look in them made him shiver. "A long time," she replied, her voice hollow, barely a whisper. "Longer than I can remember. And when you finally realize the truth, when you know that you can't leave, it's too late. You'll be one of them, just like all of us." Peter's stomach churned. He could feel the oppressive weight of the train, its curse tightening around his chest. The conductor's smile returned, cruel and satisfied. "You see, Peter, this is your fate, just like it was mine, just like it will be for everyone who steps aboard." The fog outside the train thickened, swirling in the distance, and the low, mournful whistle of the train filled the air. It wasn't just a sound, it was a calling, a siren's song that drew in all who dared to listen. And as the train continued its endless journey, Peter realized the terrible truth. The train didn't stop. It couldn't stop, and neither could they. The train rumbled along, its steady hum reverberating through the walls, but Peter could no longer feel its motion. The world outside the train had long faded into an impenetrable fog, and the faces of the other passengers, now eerily familiar in their terror, became less like people and more like husks, shells of souls trapped in an unending nightmare. "It's too late for all of us." The woman's words echoed in Peter's mind, repeating over and over again. The weight of their meaning settled deep within him. He could feel it now, the cold, suffocating grip of the train that bound him. Every attempt to fight it, to scream, to wake up, only drew him deeper into the abyss. He looked back at the conductor. His face was twisted into an expression of eerie calm, but Peter could see something flicker behind the surface, something malevolent. The conductor didn't have to speak for Peter to understand. This was not a man. This was not a person at all. This was the embodiment of the train, a vessel of darkness that consumed everything in its path. But it wasn't just the train. It was the journey itself, the endless, looped nightmare that claimed anyone who strayed too far from the world they knew. "You'll never leave." The conductor's voice was low, almost soft, as though he was whispering an intimate secret. No one leaves. Not once they've entered. Peter couldn't look away from the conductor, even as the darkness seemed to close in around him. The other passengers sat motionless, some staring ahead with vacant expressions, others murmuring in hushed, desperate tones. None of them seemed to notice Peter anymore. They were too far gone. "What is this place?" Peter's voice cracked, the words barely escaping his dry throat. He felt like a child, pleading for answers from something far beyond his understanding. "Why are we all here?" The conductor's lips twitched into that eerie, jagged smile again. He didn't answer Peter right away, but instead he stepped closer, his presence suffocating. His hand reached out, not to touch Peter, but to brush against the wall of the train. The wall seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, like it was alive. "You already know the answer," the conductor said quietly. "You just have to accept it. This place is a mirror of every soul that has ever boarded the train. It feeds on their fear, on their desperation, and in turn, it keeps them trapped here. Forever. Just like it will keep you." Peter's heart raced. His thoughts spun, each one more frantic than the last. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. The train, the passengers, the eerie conductor, it wasn't just a physical space. It was a metaphysical trap, a prison that existed between life and death, between what was real and what was not. It existed in the cracks of the world, in the forgotten spaces where the lost and broken found themselves drawn. The passengers were not simply traveling somewhere, they were stuck. And so was Peter. But then a terrifying thought crossed his mind. He wasn't just a passenger. He wasn't just trapped here with the others. He was being made to be the next conductor. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on his chest as the full realization hit him. The conductor was not simply a keeper of the train. He was part of the train itself, a manifestation of its malevolence. He was a tool, a servant to its unending hunger. And when a soul arrived desperate and broken, they were not just passengers. They were potential successors. Peter's stomach twisted with dread. He thought back to the moment the conductor had spoken to him directly, that whisper, that gaze, that cold certainty in the conductor's eyes when he said, "You will learn what they all learned." That was it. The passengers were not simply trapped for eternity. They were being groomed, being pulled into the train's dark heart to become the next keeper of its curse. The conductor had made it clear. It didn't matter how long it took. They all served the same purpose. "You're next, Peter," the woman whispered again, her eyes dim with hopelessness. "We all are." The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy shroud. His hands clenched into fists, but he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fight a curse this old, this pervasive. The train had taken everything from him, the world outside, the life he had once known. And now it was taking his very soul. He turned to the woman, his voice trembling. "How do I stop it? Is there any way out?" Her face was pale, her skin almost translucent in the dim light of the train. "There's no escape," she said simply. "The only way out is to let the train consume you. Let it swallow your soul so you can become what it wants. Peter shook his head, rejecting the idea. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't accept the fate that had been handed to him. He glanced at the other passengers. Some were still staring vacantly ahead, as though they had accepted their fate. But others were still struggling, still aware of the train's cruelty, its cold grip. They were all like him. They had all once believed there was an escape. But now they knew better. "You can try." The woman's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of years of torment. "But this is where we all belong now. All of us. The lost souls. The broken ones. The ones who never made it." Peter's chest tightened. "No," he muttered. "I won't let this happen. I won't become part of this nightmare." But even as he spoke, he could feel it, the train's pull. The weight of it pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. The walls seemed to close in, the lights flickering wildly, casting eerie shadows over the passengers' vacant eyes. "It's already begun," the woman whispered. "You'll never escape. You'll never leave this train. You're one of us now." Peter's heart pounded in his ears, and the coldness of the air seemed to suffocate him. But then something strange happened. The conductor stepped back, his smile now thin and knowing. He watched Peter with those unblinking eyes, as though waiting for something. For a moment, the train's rumble seemed to fade, and Peter could hear whispers, low and unintelligible, like voices just beyond reach. His head spun as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. He turned frantically, his eyes scanning the other passengers. The whispers were coming from them. And then it hit him. The passengers weren't just trapped, they were part of the train's curse. They weren't simply victims. They were the ones who had been claimed over the years, their souls drawn into the train, their consciousness slowly merging with the dark force that controlled it. Every time a soul came aboard, another part of the train's power was strengthened. And when the conductor chose someone new, the cycle began again. The realization struck him like a hammer. Peter wasn't just in a prison. He was part of the engine that drove this nightmare forward. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound of the voices, the whispers growing louder, the oppressive weight of the train pressing down on him. He could feel it now. He was being absorbed. His essence, his very being, was beginning to blur with the dark force of the train. It was taking him, turning him into another cog in its endless, insatiable hunger. The coldness in his chest spread, and he could feel the life draining from him. He opened his eyes to see the conductor's face again, the jagged smile stretched wide. "You understand now," the conductor said softly, his voice a caress. "You are no longer a passenger. You are part of the train, and like everyone before you, you will serve it, forever." Peter's breath caught in his throat as the world around him faded. The train's eerie hum, the whispering voices, the coldness that had enveloped his body, it all began to blur, to twist, until he could no longer distinguish where he ended and the train began. And just before everything went black, Peter understood the true horror of it all. There was no escape. The train would never stop. It would never end. And now he was a part of it, the next conductor. The train continued, endless and unstoppable. And the cycle repeated. The next soul to board was already waiting.